David Foster Wallace and William T. Vollmann were both prolific authors in the 1990s and early 2000s. And obviously, Vollmann has continued that legacy on into modern times. But what did Wallace think of Vollmann? Well, today I'm going to be bringing in multiple quotes from Wallace on Vollmann. And even better than that, in this presentation, and why I think it's going to be magical for you guys, is that I'm going to show how Vollmann and Wallace actually live very similar lives and at some level are exactly the same, especially at the start of their career. And then I'll eventually show you guys where they diverged and why that makes all the difference. So my name is Ian, and on this channel, we cover the greatest authors and books of all time. And two of those authors include David Foster Wallace and William T. Vollmann. I already have 70 videos on David Foster Wallace in the playlist down below. And starting today, I'm going to start dropping videos on William T. Vollmann. So I am now starting a playlist on William T. Vollmann, which is down below. And so let us hop into our first quote of the day from Wallace. Quote, "I've got my weird neuroses. I had this huge inferiority complex where William Vollmann's concerned. Because he and I's first books came out at the same time. And I even once read a Madison Smart Bell essay where he used me and my slender output and the inferiority of it to talk about, how great Vollmann is. And so I go around, oh no, Vollmann's had another one out. Now he's got like 5 to my 1. I go around with that stuff. But I think I'm trying to think of any example. And Wallace trails off in here and starts talking about other authors. But this is a great launching off point because Vollmann and Wallace were only born 3 years apart. And Vollmann grew up in Indiana and Wallace grew up in Illinois. And so we have two great authors living within 3 hours of each other. And what makes it even crazier is that Vollmann's father was a professor of business. And lo and behold, David Foster Wallace's parents were both professors also. And Vollmann and Wallace had different upbringings. Wallace's parents were a little bit more insistent on language, and that kind of is in Wallace's mythos a little bit more because he talks about it all the time. He talks about his mom being a snoot. I just made a 3.5-hour video on Wallace's essay, Authority in American Usage, where Wallace talks a lot about his mother in the writeconscious Substack, which includes now over 6 hours on David Foster Wallace and over 15 hours on Cormac McCarthy with more course content coming on Vollmann soon. Anyway, if you want to check that out, that's a link down. There's a link down in the description below. I didn't mean to plug that right there. But we never hear about Vollmann and his kind of also snooty, one could say, upbringing. And so both men grow up. And Vollmann had this significant moment in his life when his sister died when he was 9 years old from drowning, which I think brought him to reality a little bit more. It messed with his psychology, which we'll kind of talk about later. For better or for worse, we can talk about that later because I do know that his daughter died from alcoholism recently. And I never like to attribute how parents, and their actions, lead to how their kids act. But it seems like there's something interesting going on there with that. But Wallace had a little bit more of a chill upbringing. His parents were, fighting a lot. They eventually got divorced because I think his dad was cheating on his mom. There was a little bit more tension there, but he was more into athletics and being a jock than Vollmann was. But there was a massive divide in their lives when both decided to go to prestigious universities because the hardest college to get into, the most prestigious college in the country, is not Harvard or Amherst or Yale. It is Deep Springs College in the middle of the desert in California. Do you guys know about this school? I know about this school because I grew up in Las Vegas and my family were big skiers. My dad, speaking of talented people, just joking, my dad was a professor of statistics at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and he was from Canada and loved to ski. So we would drive a couple times a year to Mammoth to go skiing in California, and we'd drive past his college, and he would tell me this. And sometimes we'd park on the side of the road here and take our binoculars out. We had scopes for birding, and we'd look at all the people there because it was so kind of reclusive. Good memories there. But there's no cell phone service. There's no internet. They don't allow technology out there. And you live with your professors. For a long time until recently, it was a male-only college, and they've eventually allowed women in, which I disagree with, because I think that that's the point. There's male colleges and there's female colleges, and there's no real sexual tension there unless, there are gay people or something, which is fine. But it kind of reduces a lot of that, and you live with your professors. That's what you're out there for. You take philosophy class and you talk about Nietzsche or something, and then you go and see your professor later on, and he's sitting at a table and he's like, hey, Professor Wallace, or whoever, how are you doing? And you have conversations, you get to know them, the strengths and weaknesses. The class sizes are really small, and then you engage in farm work. So there's all this, this area is almost run by the students, and it really teaches these life skills and kind of these more male-oriented attributes that a lot of academics and rich kids never really get to learn, because you hear people like Oppenheimer living out on the land, or rich people having horses and these things, but most of the time they're not really putting the work in. They're just reaping the benefits of other people's work. And so that was something different. Something different that Vollmann experienced than Wallace in this first Divergent. And speaking of the New Mexico desert, you know who was an OG? These desert areas produce fucking monsters, including David Foster Wallace and yours truly, when he lived in Tucson, but none other than Douglas McArthur, shout out the greatest American general of all time, maybe not because of his subterranean landing tactics, but rather his personality, which I think is the most important thing, especially in useless wars that we probably shouldn't have been involved in the first place. Anyway, his dad actually had a post out in New Mexico, if I remember correctly, and he lived out there. But that could all just be a lie. And so Vollmann goes to Deep Springs College and eventually attends a Ivy League university in Cornell, and I think gets a master's degree at Berkeley. One biographical note to make: while Vollmann was at Cornell, he lived at the Telluride House, it's a very selective area where like the best kids live. Like, for instance, Spivak, the critical theorist that translated most famously Jacques Derrida's Grammatology, and she has her own personal critical theory on post-colonialism and colonialism and whatnot. She lived there. Francis Fukuyama and many others lived there, and it's kind of around the same time too, like within the same decade as him. So you could kind of tell that the energy was strong for him. But what did Vollmann do with his life? And so he didn't have the early success that Wallace did, because when Vollmann was 23, he drops out. He didn't get a master's degree. He drops out of his PhD program at Berkeley in comparative literature. And then for the next 7 years, he doesn't. It takes him 7 years to write a novel. But David Foster Wallace, at the age of 21 or 22, gets his first novel published, or at least accepted, The Broom of the System. And so this is when Wallace starts to gain this kind of ego and this self-consciousness that I think eventually later on kind of screws him over, and where these two kind of diverge. And Vollmann, so when we look at Wallace's life, it was somewhat padded. He goes to Amherst and he was kind of reclusive. He comes to the University of Arizona, and from all the accounts that I've read, he was not absorbing the beauty and what Tucson has to offer. Tucson, in my opinion, is the greatest desert city easily in the United States, but maybe in the entire world, just because of the vast expansiveness of terrain, the Sonoran Desert, Saguaro National Park, all the other mountain ranges, the diverse wildlife, the amount of rain we get, which is more than any other desert city in the country. We have a ski resort. Like, there's a lot going on here, and there's also a very engaged artistic community, which Wallace kind of shunned, and I think he was just trying to get his MFA and kind of leave, even though he did like kind of the West Coast culture, which he never had been exposed to before. But he didn't necessarily let the Southwest form him, and that's something important when we look at Cormac McCarthy or William T. Vollmann even, and other authors. They let it shape them, and it kind of makes you gritty. It does something to you. Those type of men are different. But when we look at the influences of Wallace and Vollmann, they also diverge in the sense that Wallace was more of a fan of, obviously, the postmodernists, which I talk about all the time. Let's get rid of this. But Vollmann is a fan of guys like Hemingway, Tolstoy, and Yukio Mishima. And they are obviously these very extroverted type of manly men, and who create these characters. Tolstoy would talk about the virtues of celibacy and be like, going after hoes and like screwing the maid and stuff. Mishima obviously was, from all available accounts from what I've read, was schizophrenic and was, creating this whole character in these weird, he was playing all these weird roles in his head. And Hemingway was obviously, suffering from mental illness, and that's why he obviously killed himself. But all individuals, even though they do cringe things, like they're cringe, I'll admit that, but they walked the walk. I am a member of the Hemingway Society. I've presented, I won't even call it that. 10 minutes isn't a presentation. I present on this channel all the time anyway, but I've been to multiple Hemingway conferences, and I attended one in Wyoming where I live a couple months of the year. I think 2 or 3 years ago, and we went and saw where Hemingway lived and where he wrote and all these different things. And living up where he was in Wyoming, especially back 100 years ago, is no fucking joke. Like, it's not easy work. It's not the Florida Keys. It's not Sacramento. It's not Tucson. Like, you're living out west. You're living in rugged territory with wild animals everywhere. And then Hemingway was a hunter and these types of things. Mishima was into bodybuilding and like, being of the mind and the body and of the soul and whatnot. And Tolstoy lived in Russia, which that's fucking hard. That if you live in Russia, you automatically get grinded down. Anyway, so we kind of have this difference in approach where Wallace is a little bit more pampered. He gets this novel published very early. Vollmann, on the other hand, goes to Afghanistan where he's doing like examining things for like humanitarian organizations and gets involved with some like rebel groups or something. This is a little spot in my mind. I'm just kind of going from what I know, but he sees some form of combat, not participating, but just with a group who is doing it. And this is reminiscent of Hemingway, of Mishima, who were men who weren't manly enough to be in the conflicts in World War II, both respectively, but participated in their own way, with Hemingway in World War I, and World War II, actually. Hemingway was crazy, man. But what's interesting, about Hemingway and Mishima, I have to make a video about this, is both were declared unfit for service, and that terrorized them, and that's why they created these really manly personas. At least that's what a lot of the Hemingway and Mishima, not just to let me drop some crazy knowledge on you guys. Mishima was gay from all available accounts, or at least bisexual, and Hemingway was an early form of forced transsexual because his mom dressed him up as a girl for, I think, till he was 6 or 7 years old in the middle of what was he, in Michigan or Illinois or whatever. And in the early 1900s, late 1800s, if you are being dressed as a girl when you're a boy and being called Ernie, how do you think that's going to go over with the guys around the neighborhood? And then growing up, you're obviously going to have this rage, this masculine trauma that you need to fulfill. And then that was further accentuated because Hemingway did not only just get rejected for World War I, but he was also injured as a paramedic in Italy, which when you tell people, hey, how'd you get injured? Well, hey, I was driving around and got hit by some shrapnel or something. That doesn't kind of ring as I got shot in the middle of the trenches while we were liberating Paris or something like that. Even though Paris never got taken over in World War I. But anyway, you guys get the point. The stories aren't as good, and both took that very to heart. And then when you kind of accentuate that and multiply that with their proclivities toward homosexuality or toward the forced femininity of Hemingway and how that was disapproved not just by the masculine community, but by their cultures in Japan and America at large, you can kind of see where we get into trouble. Woo! We've got some analysis going on today. This video is for all the haters. Right-conscious, he just surface level. Sit the fuck down. But the reason I mention all this is that Vollmann is a doer. He kind of has this more doer energy that he was out on the farm. He wasn't as pampered. And this builds a psychological strength because Vollmann kind of bounces around at jobs and is doing weird things, but eventually he returns to writing when he teaches himself computer programming in 1985. And that takes a bit of skill and motivation to do that in the 1980s because everyone and their cousin now is taking, I know Python and code and I went to code boot camp. Like everyone's doing that now. I got a computer science degree. Like, okay, yeah. Like you and everybody else. But in the 1980s, learning code by however you did it back in the 1980s, seemingly by just showing up and learning on the job, took a little bit of formability and open-mindedness and logic, which we see all three of those attributes in Vollmann's work. And while on the job, so he'd work, the 8 or 10 hours a day, and then he'd stay after and use the computers and the word processors on those to write novels, and he would subsist off of candy bars, which, and that's a wild story. And so he kind of gets into this unhealthy obsession of writing deeply, after work. We contrast this with Wallace. So what was Wallace doing? Well, he had a fellowship at the University of Arizona. He eventually bottoms out and does have to go to a halfway house and to rehab, but he's supported and he was a security guard. But the only reason he was a security guard, and this is kind of the romanticization of Wallace, he talks about, I was a security guard. That was a requirement of the program that you had to go get a normal person job because, as you're recovering, you're so bottomed out and things are so wild that you need to, interact with people and just, do something like that. So that's the only reason he was doing that. And then as soon as he kind of gained some of his prowess back, he was, being a professor for Bill Burr and then, abusing Mary Carr up in Syracuse or whatever the fuck was happening up there. All while living off of kind of, these low-paying for a while professor jobs, and then eventually he went back to the University of Illinois and from then on was cruising. But Vollmann had to fight. His first novel was somewhat successful, but didn't make him a ton of money. And returning to our first quote, he was writing prolifically. He was using the writing by the yard approach, which is you're just like writing pages at a time, like you're just dumping. And this kind of brings us to the first big point about writing I want to talk about today. So at my high school, I'm a high school teacher. For the last 6 or 7 years, I've worked at multiple schools, but I always run the creative writing club. And today I had to remind everybody, and I always give this big lecture at like 10 times a year. I'm like, who are we writing for? Ourselves. No, you're writing for the readers. Why? What are we trying to make the reader do? I don't know. Entertain them? No, we're trying to transform their lives, because if you transform their lives, they will be entertained. Then they will tell people, and then eventually you will grow. Your popularity as an author will grow. We're trying to blow people's minds. Like, remember when that movie Midsummer came out? It was a good movie or whatever, but everybody was talking about it. Like, everybody that was artsy, you gotta see Midsummer, bro. Have you read Blood Meridian, bro? Like, it's, it was that level. And so that's the goal. So I wanted to talk to you right now, my friend, my compatriot in this movement to transform lives. So let's say you had this manuscript in your hands. Like, let's say you had all the time in the world and you made this manuscript, and it can transform people's lives. Like, it's fire, right? It's good. But it's 80% there. For instance, when you look at authors like Cormac McCarthy and David Foster Wallace, they spent 5 to 10 years revising their novels. They put a ton of time into it. And they were probably in 2 years, 80% of the way done. But the other 5 to 10 years was spent adding these little Easter eggs and contrasts and all these different things. And for those of you guys who care, speaking of a lot of this, I've recently gained access to the new interviews that are only available in the archive from Cormac and McCarthy that are so crazy. I can't wait to blow your guys' minds, because he talks for the first time ever. None of this has ever been released online about how you write sentences. And like, I got like hundreds of videos that I'm going to do from all this information anyway. But he was really into like building these things. So you are an author, okay? First time author, and you have a book, but it's only 80% done. Do you want to spend the next couple years, let's call it 5 years, revising it to make it better? Or do you want to release it as it is now? Because I don't know if you put all that extra work in, that's going to sell more copies. In those 5 years, let's say if it sells 1,000 or 2,000 more copies, well, that's only a couple $1,000s more for you for a couple years of effort. And so what would you do? Would you publish it now and move on to the next novel? Or would you wait, a little bit longer? And these are important questions, because they kind of get into this idea of legacy. Because it's, when we look at the writing audience at large out there, the reading audiences at large out there, they want their time to be used wisely. They want to be transformed and read something that's important. And when we go back to like the 1920s to the 1940s or early paperback publications, what was really awesome is that a lot of books that were written was like, it was someone at the end of their life, like Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill. It was great. I've been commissioned by Andrew Carnegie to spend 10 years studying the greatest and wealthiest people in the world and what they did. And these are the 12 principles that I came up with, yada, yada, yada. And that was a big thing that a lot of people, did. They kind of wrote these capstone books where they dropped all their knowledge. But now when there's millions of books being published a year, it's been watered down. This idea of a book and, integrity within the written word is now been diminished. And so by releasing some of these capstone books, it really does set you apart with the common reader. And so that's why when you talk to the normal person who reads and knows about maybe David Foster Wallace or Cormac McCarthy, they've maybe not been Vollman pilled yet, because it's kind of like this weird closet over here. Because I think Vollman has his prolific writing pace kind of lends itself to creating this massive bibliography that has the potential for massive transformation for someone who's consumed it. I've consumed his entire bibliography. We'll kind of talk about one or two of his works at some level of detail to kind of exemplify one of the quotes that we'll be reading from Wallace in a second in a little while. But what would you do? Would you rather have more things out, or would you rather have kind of this smaller collection? Like, guys, Cormac McCarthy made it to 89 years old, and he released his last novel, his last 2 novels, 6 months before he died. Like, he stretched it a long fucking time. And so comment down below what you guys would pick. And if you guys would like to learn about the David Foster Wallace's 400 favorite books, I have a free PDF in the link down below. If you want to support me and the channel without joining the Substack or anything else, or even liking the video or leaving a comment, that could be a win-win for both of us. because you will have the greatest resource on Wallace's influences on the internet right now, and I will provide to you exclusive articles and videos occasionally through emails. Most of the time it's stuff I can't post on YouTube because it's maybe just a little too weird or out there, or, you know, you guys understand. Anyway, so Wallace has an animosity, does have this weird itch about the prolificness of Vollmann, but that's because, going back to this idea, Vollmann is talented, because I feel like when I look at his writing that he almost writes by the yard and moves through things and can write that 80% almost from talent alone. And I understand that he revises and yada, 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 but it feels like he understands almost just logically and with this weird intuition how to form something that can transform you. Because his work isn't simple. His work doesn't transform you like a Haruki, however you say his fucking name, you know, Murakami, who, you know, has this magical realism in these things. You kind of see reality different and feel good. No, he's writing complicated narratives that are actually very advanced, and that and something that 99.9% people who call themselves fiction authors couldn't do if you put a gun to their heads and gave them 5 years with unlimited resources. And from what I could tell about Wallace, he is more of an emotional person. Vollmann, from what I've seen in interviews and whatnot, doesn't seem to have that emotionality, because Wallace was on the host circuit. Wallace was sleeping with his college students and single mothers just so he could, just because he liked ruining single mothers even more. He wasn't listening when he was living in California to Tom Likas, and he kind of had that more dynamic, feminine, in the best way possible, you know, personality, and so do I, honestly. Hopefully I've integrated. I mean, that's the goal of all of us, you guys. We want to integrate between, you know, Hemingway and Proust. You know, you want to balance masculine and feminine consciousness, not physically, but rather, you know, within the sphere of attributes, and gain them all. You know, men are, you know, can be very courageous, and, you know, women can be very caring, or these type of very simple things, but we can all embody those ideals and move on and create change and beautiful things in the world. Okay, moving on. So hopping into our next quote, what's precious about someone like Bill Vollmann is that even though there's a great deal of formal innovation in his fictions, it rarely seems to exist just for its own sake. It's almost always deployed to make some point. Vollmann's the most editorial young novelist going right now, and he's great at using formal ingenuity to make the editorializing a component of his narrative instead of an interruption, or to create an effect that's internal to the text. His narrator's always weirdly effaced, the writing unself-conscious. Despite all the by the way, dear reader intrusions, in a way it's sad that Vollmann's integrity is so remarkable. Its remarkability means it's rare. So both Vollmann and Wallace do dabble in the postmodernists, even metafiction at times in their works. But what kind of the postmodernists like Vollmann and Wallace were trying to do was do this effacement, or this unself-conscious writing, where you do make these interjections, you do go a little bit meta at times. However, the narrative voice remains unattached. It doesn't feel like David Foster Wallace or William T. Vollmann is the one talking to you. It's a really weird phenomena, and it helps you remain immersed. And Wallace calls this editorializing, which is somewhat common to Vollmann because he's a journalist. He does do war correspondence, and that's something that I don't think I've mentioned in this video, why I rank them so highly, somewhat in like my greatest authors of the 21st century kind of lists, because they both engage in nonfiction and fiction writing, and that really helps me show, you know, different angles of their consciousness and really get more invested as a reader. You know, as I talked about before, I finally got access to these secret thoughts of Cormac McCarthy, and like, why can't I have all of it? Like, it seems silly that he wasn't writing more nonfiction and doing these things and kind of expressing himself more, because it would create a lot of good in the world. And he has his own reasons, which he actually talks about. But today I want to talk about William T. Vollmann's most popular book. And what's so sad about this, you guys, is that if you look at Tommy Orange, I don't know if you guys know Tommy Orange. He wrote this book up here. It's called There. It's a Native American fiction. He signed it for me. Really cool guy. I walked up to him and I said, "Bro, that book was sick. Like, that was some dope shit, man." And he was like, and he got shocked. He was like, "What? No one's ever said that to me before." I was like, "You do readings all the time." He's like, and then I realized, like, I saw everyone else in the crowd. They go walk up to him. "You really showed me a different perspective on Native Americans. You really brought light to the movement in Oakland." And it was okay. And then him and I had a cool conversation about the word hyphy and the whole hyphy movement in the 90s in the Bay Area. Shout out William T. Vollmann, who also was involved with the Bay Area and the whole hyphy movement. That's where I wear my Right Conscious Streetwear 3XL. Anyway, this is a good book. I would even go as far as recommending it if you're trying to kind of gain knowledge in the field of Native American fiction and want to kind of read something that follows the big five, which is Leslie Marmon Silko's Ceremony, James Welch's The Winter and Blood, and M. Scott Momaday's Housemaid of Dawn, Louise Erdrich's book, Louise Erdrich's book Love Medicine, and then Gerald Wiesner's book Bearheart. Those books are called the Big Five of Native American fiction because some publications have restricted people from sending in journals about them anymore. When I was trying to get some stuff published that I wrote on, honestly, a couple of those different novels, they were restricted because there have just been thousands of submissions on these same 5 novels. So anyway, when you hear kind of new Native American voices and stuff, it's a big deal. But this Their book has 182,000 rankings. And obviously this book was kind of pushed in this diversity quota and woke way, kind of, oh, it's a new big thing and yada, yada, yada. So that's why it has that. But when we kind of transition over to William T. Vollmann, his most popular novel, Europe Central, has 3,000 ratings, and then everything below that, like we're getting below 1,300, and that's sad. I mean, this is the fall of the literary world right before our eyes, through statistics. And so Vollmann is not very successful, but I'm going to kind of talk about his novel really fast and what Wallace is talking about without spoiling anything. But I do recommend you should go grab it. I'll try to remember to put the link to Europe Central down in the description below. It's a pretty good place to start. And so speaking of World War II and Douglas MacArthur, Europe Central focuses on World War II, especially on the Soviet and German sides of the novel, but it mixes historical accounts, fictionalized accounts, and these biographical sketches to kind of give you this very advanced and very beautiful kind of historical fiction. And so these kind of vehicles and these characters help him inject some of his own thoughts and feelings about history and philosophy into the characters, but it doesn't necessarily feel like it's him, but it's him ranting. Like, it doesn't feel like Cormac McCarthy. Like when you read, if any of you guys out there have read Cormac McCarthy's The Passenger or Stella Maris, as I always say, it was like he was on his deathbed and he was like, you know what? I'm going to tell all you motherfuckers off. Fuck Carl Jung, fuck Einstein, like all these different guys. Like he was like one last shot at a couple people. Among some of the better qualities of The Passenger and Stella Maris, books that I love and I think could be argued to be McCarthy's greatest novels if read correctly and if you kind of get into the nuances of them. But there's some of these kind of crotchety old man elements to it. And, and people like Ayn Rand don't do this very good. And I talked about in my earlier video, how to write philosophical novels. Go check that one out, how not to do this. But Vollmann kind of errs away from a lot of this and injects a lot of his philosophy without, like, as Wallace says, it feeling, too intense. So the novel opens with a guy named Roman Karman, if I remember correctly, and he's this Russian film director. And so we kind of get this analogy to Russia and what is happening through this film. Like, this isn't going to be a crazy spoiler or anything that's important. But he goes on this beautiful kind of exploration through this character and this film of how history is constructed, reality versus propaganda. And his editorializing on the malleability of historical truth is like almost a lesson on the construction of his story. And another technique that Vollmann uses, which Wallace also uses, and I think it's strong if you know what you're doing, is we're working through all these characters who are helping us construct this vision. Like there's a Russian general that defects to become like a German soldier, and we get his multifaceted view. We see the people on the ground, so normal soldiers and their views, and constantly Vollmann is kind of injecting a little bit too much in terms of the classic narrative technique, his own opinions. And so for us here, I give you guys my blessing to kind of engage in this practice, because I think this is one of the keys. This is something I've noticed. Maybe you guys can, agree with me to some of these epic works. The 3 people we've talked about in this video today, Wallace, Vollmann, McCarthy, all do this. Cormac McCarthy in all his novels. He has Judge Holden sitting and giving a campfire disquisition. He has in the Border Trilogy these random people, especially in The Crossing, that go on these long rants that are really just McCarthy's, contemplation of God and fatalism and all these different things. And like this is kind of similar and true through a lot of his novels, especially some of the more major ones. Others are more like entertainment oriented, like No Country for Old Men and The Road and All the Pretty Horses, even though that they have these kind of philosophical injunctions. But I never feel until I kind of read the Stella Maris and The Passenger, like McCarthy was projecting onto me. Same with Infinite Jest. Wallace did so well that he denied that he was an addict. People had to find personal information about him for him to even admit that he had a little bit of trouble and tried to commit suicide. But he never talked about a lot of these major things because he kept it all under wraps. because the imagination was so good, and he had these characters that he could hide behind the characters. This is Don Gately, who did this or whatever. And I would say the same's true about Vollmann. And people can't understand aesthetics most of the time. Like, you could write something beautiful, but if you have someone who doesn't understand the complexities of style, most of the time it's lost on them. Like, you hear this all the time with new readers reading Blood Meridian. They're like, I don't like all this jargon. I don't like all this fancy talk. I just kind of like the story and some of the crazy scenes. They don't understand what McArthur, is doing with his kind of aesthetic elevation. And so you can't necessarily just rely on that anymore, especially if you're trying to change. You'll change writers' lives. Like, if I read something that's aesthetically beautiful, this happens all the time with poetry. It doesn't change my life, but it changes and makes me a better writer and all these other things, and changes my day-to-day thinking. Like, damn, I need to start using M dashes in every single sentence. But real topics, this type of writing actually can transform your soul. And I guess the third option you see is like characters, like guys like Jonathan Franzen, who's a part of this era. He like creates these characters and they have conflicts and they get cheated on. And he's a good writer. He's a great writer. What's that book? Freedom? That's a pretty good book. I like that book. But at the end of Jonathan Franzen's Freedom, I didn't learn anything. I was like, Jonathan Franzen, you're a good writer and you're weird and you're kind of pretentious. Hey, wait, I felt like that before. So you guys get the point. I think this is valuable stuff that we should all be kind of working into a lot of our stuff. We are valuable. We have to make convictions. You just heard that in my Dostoevsky thing. Like, that's what we're supposed to do. That's what makes people love you. That's what can make you a legend, if you can tap into the cultural current and do it in a good way. So thank you guys for being here. If you want to support a broke teacher, go subscribe to the Substack, or just give me a thumbs up, leave a comment, say what's up. Go light your refrigerator on fire in front of your neighbors and show them who's the boss.